What happens when the people we trust to care for our loved ones in death are doing something far worse than simply preparing bodies for burial? How many funeral directors have discovered that embalming fluid isn't the only thing being pumped into the deceased, or that the closed casket services they recommend aren't really about preserving dignity? When families gather to say their final goodbyes, do they ever wonder why some funeral homes insist on keeping the preparation rooms locked even from grief-stricken relatives, or why certain bodies are scheduled for cremation with unusual urgency? In the death care industry, where we surrender our most vulnerable loved ones to the care of strangers, some funeral homes have discovered that the dead can be profitable in ways that go far beyond caskets and burial plots. And the people who work there have learned to stop asking questions about what really happens in the basement after midnight. Thomas Garrett had been working as a funeral director's assistant at Riverside Memorial home in suburban Atlanta for 3 weeks when he first noticed that something was fundamentally wrong with how the business operated. The wrongness wasn't obvious or dramatic. No bodies sitting up on embalming tables or mysterious sounds in the night, but rather a subtle pattern of procedures and practices that didn't quite match what Thomas had learned during his mortuary science training. The first discrepancy Thomas noticed involved the scheduling of body preparations. Standard practice in the funeral industry was to embalm bodies as soon as possible after death to slow decomposition and prepare them for viewing. But at Riverside Memorial, certain bodies were deliberately left in cold storage for days or even weeks before preparation began, while others were rushed through embalming with unusual urgency regardless of when their funeral services were scheduled. Thomas initially assumed these scheduling variations reflected family preferences or logistical constraints he wasn't aware of. But as he became more familiar with the funeral home's operations, he realized that the delays and urgencies followed patterns that had nothing to do with families' wishes or service dates. Bodies with specific characteristics, particular ages, certain causes of death, specific health histories documented in their death certificates, were consistently delayed, while others were processed immediately. His supervisor, a 40-year veteran of the funeral industry named Ronald Blackwell, offered vague explanations when Thomas asked about the irregular scheduling. Different situations required different approaches, Blackwell would say, or the family requested specific timing, even when Thomas knew the families had expressed no such preferences. The evasiveness suggested that Blackwell was hiding something, but Thomas couldn't determine what purpose the scheduling variations served. The second discrepancy involved the funeral home's relationship with Greystone Medical Research, a company that purchased donated bodies for scientific study. Body donation was a legitimate and valuable practice that allowed medical schools and research facilities to advance their understanding of human anatomy and disease. But at Riverside Memorial, the relationship with Greystone seemed to go beyond normal donation protocols. Thomas discovered this when he was asked to prepare paperwork for a body being transferred to Greystone, despite the deceased's family having made no mention of donation during their arrangements conference. When Thomas questioned whether proper consent had been obtained, Blackwell assured him that everything was handled at corporate level, and that his job was simply to prepare the transfer documentation. But Thomas's mortuary training had emphasized the critical importance of informed consent in body donation. Families needed to explicitly agree to donation, understanding exactly how their loved one's remains would be used. The casual way Riverside Memorial transferred bodies to Greystone without apparent family involvement suggested that proper protocols were not being followed. Thomas's concerns about irregular practices at Riverside Memorial intensified during his 4th week when he was assigned to assist with an after-hours preparation. The deceased was an elderly man who had died of natural causes, with a funeral service scheduled for the following week. Plenty of time for standard embalming procedures during normal business hours. But Blackwell insisted the preparation needed to happen immediately at 11 p.m., with only Thomas and Blackwell present in the funeral home. The preparation itself followed standard embalming procedures until the very end, when Blackwell did something Thomas had never seen before. After the embalming was complete and the body had been prepared for viewing, Blackwell drew several vials of fluid from various parts of the body using syringes and sealed them in containers labeled with codes that meant nothing to Thomas. "What are those samples for?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his tone professionally curious rather than accusatory. Blackwell's response was matter-of-fact, as if what he was doing was completely normal. "Tissue and fluid samples for Greystone's research programs. They pay premium rates for fresh samples from bodies that meet specific criteria. It's a significant revenue stream for the funeral home." Thomas's mortuary training had included discussions of legitimate tissue donation for transplant and research, but those programs operated under strict protocols that required explicit consent from deceased persons or their families. What Blackwell was describing sounded more like body harvesting without consent, using funeral homes as covert collection sites for medical research companies that were willing to pay for materials obtained through ethically questionable means. "Did the family consent to this?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The consent is handled through language in our general services contract," Blackwell explained, showing Thomas a dense paragraph buried in the middle of the standard funeral services agreement that families signed. The language was deliberately vague and technical, referring to disposition of biological materials and participation in medical advancement programs in ways that most grieving families would never understand or question. Thomas realized that Riverside Memorial was systematically harvesting tissue and fluids from bodies in their care, using misleading contract language to obtain technical consent, while ensuring families had no real understanding of what they were agreeing to. The practice was likely legal in a narrow technical sense, but it was deeply unethical and violated every principle of informed consent that Thomas had been taught was fundamental to ethical death care. But harvesting tissue samples without genuine informed consent was just the beginning of what Thomas would discover about Riverside Memorial's operations. The real horror became apparent during his 5th week, when he was finally given access to the funeral home's basement level, an area he had been told was off-limits to new employees until they had proven themselves reliable and discreet. The basement was supposed to contain additional cold storage, a crematory, and various utility systems that supported the funeral home's operations. But what Thomas found when Blackwell finally granted him access was a facility that bore little resemblance to conventional funeral home infrastructure. The space was divided into multiple rooms, each equipped with medical equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than what would be needed for standard body preparation. One room contained what appeared to be an operating theater, complete with surgical lights, monitoring equipment, and instrument trays that held scalpels, retractors, and other surgical tools. Another room was lined with refrigeration units that were more extensive and complex than the simple body storage coolers typical of funeral homes. A third room contained laboratory equipment, microscopes, centrifuges, incubators, that suggested active research or testing was being conducted on the premises. "This is where we do the real work," Blackwell explained, noting Thomas's obvious shock at the basement's true nature. "Greystone pays Riverside Memorial very well to serve as a collection and preliminary processing site for their research programs. We're not just a funeral home. We're the front end of a supply chain that provides biological materials to research facilities across the Southeast." Thomas struggled to process what Blackwell was telling him. Riverside Memorial wasn't simply harvesting small tissue samples as he had initially discovered. It was conducting systematic harvesting operations that treated the deceased as sources of biological materials rather than people who deserved dignified handling. The funeral home above was essentially a facade that provided legitimate cover for operations that were far more profitable and far less ethical than conventional death care services. "The families think we're simply preparing their loved ones for burial or cremation," Blackwell continued, apparently unbothered by the massive deception he was describing. "And we do provide those services eventually. But first we harvest everything that Greystone has requested. Organs, tissue samples, bone marrow, even skin and corneas in some cases. The bodies are still intact enough for viewing when we're done, and the families never know that their loved ones provided materials for research that they never consented to." Thomas's horror at these revelations was compounded by the realization that he had unknowingly participated in this system during his 3 weeks at Riverside Memorial. Every body he had helped prepare had likely been subjected to unauthorized harvesting before the embalming process he assisted with. He had been complicit in a massive ethical violation without even knowing it. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked, suspecting that employees who discovered Riverside Memorial's true operations were not simply allowed to quit and find work elsewhere. Blackwell's expression made it clear that Thomas's suspicion was correct, because you're either going to become part of the operation willingly, with full knowledge of what we do and appropriate compensation for your discretion, or you're going to become a liability that needs to be managed. The choice is yours, but understand that walking away isn't as simple as giving 2 weeks' notice. The implicit threat was obvious. Thomas had learned too much about Riverside Memorial's operations to simply leave and find work at another funeral home. If he refused to cooperate, there would be consequences beyond simple termination of employment. Blackwell's calm demeanor while making these threats suggested that he had delivered similar ultimatums to other employees who had discovered the funeral home's secrets. Thomas chose cooperation over confrontation, accepting Blackwell's offer to become a full participant in Riverside Memorial's harvesting operations, while he figured out how to expose the facility without putting himself in danger. Over the following weeks, he documented everything he could about the funeral home's relationship with Greystone Medical Research, the procedures used for unauthorized tissue harvesting, and the ways consent was manipulated through misleading contract language. What Thomas discovered during his covert investigation was far more extensive and disturbing than he had initially realized. Riverside Memorial was not an isolated operation, but part of a network of funeral homes throughout the Southeast that served as collection sites for Greystone. The network moved biological materials worth millions of dollars annually, taking advantage of families' trust in funeral homes to harvest tissues and organs that legitimate donation programs could never obtain in such quantities. The materials were used for various purposes, some legitimate and some highly questionable. Some harvested tissues went to university research programs that believed they were receiving properly consented donations. Other materials were sold to pharmaceutical companies testing new products. The most disturbing materials went to private clinics that offered experimental treatments to wealthy clients, willing to pay premium prices for therapies that hadn't been approved by regulatory authorities. Thomas's investigation also revealed that Greystone's criteria for body selection went beyond simple medical factors. The company paid premium rates for materials harvested from bodies of specific ages, ethnicities, and health backgrounds, suggesting that they were fulfilling orders for particular types of biological materials, rather than conducting general medical research. Some of the specifications were so detailed that Thomas suspected Greystone might be matching harvested materials to specific recipients or research projects before bodies even arrived at Riverside Memorial. The most disturbing aspect of the operation was what happened to bodies that were particularly valuable as sources of biological materials. These bodies, usually young, healthy individuals who had died from trauma rather than disease, were subjected to extensive harvesting that went far beyond tissue samples. Organs, bone marrow, blood, skin, corneas, and even bone tissue were systematically removed, with the bodies being reconstructed using filler materials and careful cosmetic work to disguise the extent of what had been taken. Thomas witnessed several of these extensive harvesting procedures during his weeks as a cooperating employee at Riverside Memorial. The skill and efficiency with which Blackwell and other senior staff conducted these operations suggested years of practice and refinement. They could strip a body of valuable biological materials and restore it to viewing-ready condition in a matter of hours, leaving families completely unaware that their loved one had been systematically harvested before burial or cremation. The financial scale of the operation was staggering. Thomas discovered invoices from Greystone showing payments to Riverside Memorial that often exceeded $50,000 per body for extensive harvesting operations. Even simple tissue sample collections brought in thousands of dollars, representing revenue that dwarfed what the funeral home earned from conventional services. Blackwell had been telling the truth when he said the harvesting operation was the real business. Funeral services were essentially a loss leader that provided access to the biological materials where the real money was made. Thomas's documentation of Riverside Memorial's operations was nearly complete when he discovered something that transformed his investigation from exposing unethical practices into preventing active harm. Among the paperwork for bodies scheduled for harvesting, Thomas found files for several individuals who hadn't actually died yet. The files contained medical records, death certificates with dates that hadn't occurred, and detailed harvest plans for people who were currently alive but in vulnerable situations: elderly individuals in nursing homes, hospice patients with terminal diagnoses, homeless people with no family connections. The files suggested that Riverside Memorial wasn't just harvesting materials from people who had died naturally. They were targeting living individuals and accelerating their deaths to obtain biological materials that would be fresher and more valuable. The evidence of pre-planned harvesting from people who hadn't died yet was the final proof Thomas needed that Riverside Memorial had crossed from unethical, but possibly legal practices into outright murder. He collected copies of the pre-death files, secured his other documentation, and prepared to take his evidence to law enforcement authorities who could shut down the operation and investigate the full scope of Greystone's activities. But before Thomas could execute his plan, Blackwell discovered that he had been copying files and documenting procedures. The confrontation occurred late on a Thursday night when Thomas was alone in the funeral home's administrative office, scanning the pre-death files. Blackwell arrived unexpectedly, along with two other men Thomas recognized as senior staff from other Riverside Memorial locations. "We've been monitoring your computer usage," Blackwell said without preamble. "You've been copying files you weren't authorized to access. That's a violation of your employment agreement and potentially a crime under Georgia's computer fraud statutes." Thomas had prepared for this possibility and had already uploaded his documentation to secure cloud storage that Riverside Memorial couldn't access or delete. "I've documented everything," he said, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "The harvesting, the falsified consent, the pre-death files. If anything happens to me, that documentation goes automatically to the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and several news organizations." Blackwell's expression suggested that he had encountered similar threats before. "You've misunderstood what you've seen," he said calmly. "The pre-death files you're concerned about are simply advanced preparation for expected deaths. Funeral homes routinely prepare documentation in advance for hospice patients and others with terminal diagnoses. There's nothing sinister about efficient planning." The explanation was plausible enough that Thomas realized his evidence might not be as conclusive as he had hoped. The pre-death files could potentially be explained as advanced preparation rather than evidence of planned murder. Without proof that Riverside Memorial had actually accelerated anyone's death, his documentation would likely be dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled employee who had misinterpreted legitimate practices. "But the unauthorized harvesting is still happening," Thomas insisted. "Families aren't giving informed consent. The contract language is deliberately misleading." Blackwell nodded, unconcerned by this accusation. "The consent language in our contracts has been reviewed by attorneys and found to be legally sufficient. Families are informed that biological materials may be used for medical research. That they don't fully understand the scope of what they're consenting to is unfortunate, but it's not illegal. At worst, it's an ethical gray area that would result in bad publicity rather than criminal charges." Thomas realized that Riverside Memorial had structured its operations carefully to remain just within legal boundaries while maximizing the harvesting of valuable biological materials. The pre-death files that had seemed like smoking gun evidence of planned murder could be explained away as advanced preparation. The misleading consent language was likely defensible under existing laws. Even the extensive nature of the harvesting could be justified as making full use of donated materials in accordance with the contracts families had signed. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked, understanding that his leverage was far weaker than he had hoped. "Now we negotiate," Blackwell replied. "You have documentation of practices that would be embarrassing if made public, and that might result in regulatory scrutiny that would be expensive and time-consuming to address. We have resources and legal representation that would make your life very difficult if you chose to make allegations against us. The sensible solution is a separation agreement that provides you with financial compensation in exchange for your confidentiality and your agreement not to work in the funeral industry in Georgia." The offer was essentially a bribe to buy Thomas's silence, combined with an employment restriction that would prevent him from using his mortuary training in his home state. But Blackwell was right that Thomas's evidence was probably insufficient to result in criminal charges, and going public with allegations would likely ruin his career in the death care industry while doing minimal damage to Riverside Memorial's operations. Thomas negotiated a separation agreement that provided him with 6 months' salary and released him from the employment restriction, allowing him to seek work at funeral homes outside Georgia. He signed away his right to discuss his experiences at Riverside Memorial publicly, but retained his documentation, believing he might find opportunities to expose the operation in the future when he had stronger evidence or more influential allies. But Thomas's separation from Riverside Memorial didn't end his involvement with the funeral home's operations or his knowledge of what was happening to the deceased in their care. After he left, Thomas continued monitoring Riverside Memorial and other funeral homes he suspected of being part of Greystone's network, looking for evidence that would be sufficient to trigger investigations that his incomplete documentation couldn't support. What Thomas discovered during his monitoring was that Riverside Memorial represented just one node in a much larger network of funeral homes and medical research facilities that had essentially created a black market in human biological materials. Greystone Medical Research was the largest but not the only company involved in this network, purchasing materials from funeral homes across the Southeast and distributing them to research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and private clinics throughout the country. The network operated by exploiting gaps in regulations governing body donation and tissue transplantation. Legitimate programs were subject to strict oversight and consent requirements, but the harvesting that occurred in funeral homes fell into regulatory gray areas that hadn't been addressed by most state laws. Funeral homes had legitimate reasons to handle bodies and could claim they were simply facilitating medical research through broadly worded consent agreements. Thomas also discovered that his suspicions about the pre-death files had been correct. Several of the individuals whose files he had found died within weeks of the dates predicted in their documentation, with their bodies being harvested extensively by Riverside Memorial. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that the funeral home was indeed accelerating deaths to obtain fresh biological materials. But proving this connection required evidence that Thomas couldn't obtain from outside the funeral industry. He needed access to medical records, death certificates, and internal communications between Riverside Memorial and the facilities where targeted individuals were residing. He needed testimony from employees who were willing to violate their confidentiality agreements and risk their careers to expose the truth. Thomas spent over a year building his case, reaching out to other former employees of Riverside Memorial and similar facilities, documenting patterns of suspicious deaths, and trying to find journalists or investigators who would take seriously allegations about systematic harvesting of biological materials from the deceased. His efforts met with limited success. Former employees were reluctant to speak on the record, death certificates showed natural causes that were difficult to question, and most journalists treated his allegations as conspiracy theories rather than credible exposés. The breakthrough in Thomas's investigation came from an unexpected source. A hospice nurse named Catherine Mills contacted him after reading his anonymous posts in mortuary industry forums about ethical concerns in funeral home operations. Catherine had been working at a hospice facility that had an unusually close relationship with Riverside Memorial, with the funeral home handling nearly all deaths that occurred in the facility. Catherine had noticed that patients whose medical conditions suggested they had weeks or months to live were dying much more quickly after Riverside Memorial staff began visiting the facility to pre-plan funeral arrangements with families. The acceleration of deaths was subtle enough that it could be attributed to the natural unpredictability of terminal illness, but the pattern was consistent enough that Catherine suspected the pre-planning visits were covering for something more sinister. "They're doing something when they visit," Catherine told Thomas during their first meeting. "The patients are alone with Riverside Memorial staff for extended periods while families discuss arrangements in conference rooms. When the staff leave, patients deteriorate rapidly, usually dying within 24 to 48 hours. I've been documenting these patterns for the past 6 months." Catherine's documentation provided the evidence Thomas had been lacking: a clear connection between Riverside Memorial's activities and accelerated deaths of individuals whose biological materials would be valuable for harvesting. The evidence still wasn't definitive proof of murder, but it was strong enough to justify official investigations that could obtain the medical records and testimony needed to build a criminal case. Thomas and Catherine took their combined evidence to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, providing documentation of the harvesting operations, the suspicious death patterns, and the pre-death files that suggested advanced planning of harvesting procedures. The GBI opened an investigation that eventually expanded to include federal authorities, as the interstate nature of Greystone's network meant that multiple jurisdictions were affected. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the biological materials harvesting network that had operated largely undetected for over a decade. Riverside Memorial was just one of 47 funeral homes across 9 states that served as collection sites for Greystone medical research. The network had harvested materials from thousands of deceased individuals, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, while providing biological materials to research facilities and medical clinics that asked few questions about sourcing. Most disturbing were the findings related to accelerated deaths. Investigators discovered that Riverside Memorial staff had been administering substances during pre-planning visits that accelerated the dying process for individuals whose biological materials were particularly valuable. The substances used were difficult to detect in standard toxicology screenings, and their effects mimicked natural disease progression, allowing the deaths to appear completely normal to medical staff and families. The evidence eventually led to criminal charges against Blackwell and 17 other employees of Riverside Memorial and associated facilities. Greystone Medical Research was shut down, and its executives faced federal charges related to conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The investigation also led to comprehensive reforms in regulations governing tissue donation and body handling by funeral homes, closing the gaps that had allowed the harvesting network to operate. But the scandal's revelation also created profound trauma for thousands of families who learned that their loved ones had been subjected to unauthorized harvesting after death. Many families filed civil lawsuits seeking damages, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the violation of trust they had experienced. The knowledge that the funeral homes they had trusted had treated their loved ones as sources of biological materials rather than people worthy of dignity was devastating. Thomas's role in exposing the harvesting network made him a controversial figure in the funeral industry. Some praised him as a whistleblower who had prevented the continuation of deeply unethical practices. Others criticized him for damaging the reputation of an entire profession by revealing practices that most funeral homes didn't engage in. His career in mortuary services was effectively over, as his name was too closely associated with the scandal for any funeral home to consider employing him. Thomas eventually left the death care industry entirely, becoming an advocate for reform in body donation practices and regulations governing funeral home operations. His experience at Riverside Memorial had taught him that the trust families placed in death care professionals created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those motivated by profit rather than service. The work of preventing such exploitation required not just individual ethics but strong regulations and oversight that many in the industry resisted as burdensome interference. The reforms that followed the Riverside Memorial scandal included requirements for much more specific consent language in funeral home contracts, mandatory reporting of all tissue donations to state authorities, and criminal penalties for unauthorized harvesting of biological materials. But Thomas understood that regulations alone couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. Death made people vulnerable, and that vulnerability would always create opportunities for exploitation by those willing to profit from grief and trust. The families affected by Riverside Memorial's operations struggled to find closure and peace with what had happened to their loved ones. Some found comfort in knowing that the harvesting had at least contributed to medical research that might benefit others. Others remained traumatized by the violation of their trust and the knowledge that their final acts of care for deceased family members had been manipulated by people they had relied upon during their most vulnerable moments. Thomas's final reflection on his experiences at Riverside Memorial and the network it was part of focused on the importance of questioning authority and institutions, even those that society treated as inherently trustworthy. Funeral homes occupied positions of profound trust in communities, caring for the deceased and supporting grieving families through the most difficult experiences of their lives. That trust created assumptions that funeral directors were motivated by service and compassion rather than profit. But the reality was that funeral homes were businesses operating in an industry where emotions and vulnerability made families easy to exploit. The trust that should have protected the deceased instead created opportunities for their bodies to be treated as commodities, harvested for valuable materials that could be sold to the highest bidder. The people who worked in these facilities often saw nothing wrong with what they were doing, having been acculturated into systems that treated unethical practices as normal business operations. The horror of what had happened at Riverside Memorial wasn't just the physical violation of the deceased, but the systematic betrayal of trust that thousands of families had placed in an institution they believed was helping them honor their loved ones with dignity. Every family that had used Riverside Memorial's services over the years the harvesting network operated had potentially been deceived, their loved ones subjected to procedures they would never have consented to if given full information. Thomas's work exposing these practices had prevented the continuation of the specific network he had discovered, but he understood that similar operations likely existed in other parts of the country, taking advantage of regulatory gaps and exploiting the trust that made families vulnerable. The death care industry had been shown to contain people willing to profit from deception and violation, and protecting families required vigilance that most people couldn't maintain while dealing with grief. The lesson Thomas took from his experience was that even the most trusted institutions needed oversight and accountability, that regulations protecting vulnerable people were not burdensome interference, but necessary safeguards against exploitation. The deceased and their families deserved protection from those who would treat death as just another business opportunity, and providing that protection required acknowledging that not everyone in positions of trust was worthy of that trust. Years after exposing Riverside Memorial's operations, Thomas still received contacts from people who suspected they had been victimized by similar practices at other funeral homes. He helped where he could, connecting these people with investigators and advocates who might be able to address their concerns. But he also knew that many cases of exploitation were never discovered, that families often remained completely unaware that their loved ones had been violated because the physical evidence was hidden, and the emotional vulnerability of grief prevented the critical questioning that might have revealed the truth. The funeral industry continued to serve essential social functions, helping families navigate death with compassion and professionalism. Most funeral directors were ethical practitioners who honored their commitments to dignified care of the deceased. But the existence of operations like Riverside Memorial demonstrated that the industry also contained people who were willing to exploit trust for profit, treating the deceased as resources to be harvested rather than people to be honored. Thomas's advocacy work focused on empowering families to ask questions, demand transparency, and insist on detailed consent forms that clearly explained any use of biological materials from deceased loved ones. He worked to close regulatory gaps that allowed exploitation and to increase oversight of funeral home operations. Most importantly, he tried to ensure that the horror of what had happened at Riverside Memorial led to lasting changes that would protect future families from similar violations of trust. The deceased could not advocate for themselves or consent to procedures that might be performed on their bodies. They depended entirely on the ethics and integrity of the people entrusted with their care after death. When that trust was betrayed, as it had been at Riverside Memorial and doubtless was being betrayed at other facilities across the country, the violation was complete and irremediable. The dead couldn't object, couldn't resist, couldn't even know that they were being used in ways their families would never have permitted. That fundamental vulnerability of the deceased, combined with the emotional vulnerability of grieving families, created conditions where exploitation could flourish if ethical standards and regulatory oversight were insufficient. Thomas had learned through bitter experience that trust alone was not adequate protection, that the death care industry needed robust accountability systems to ensure that the people who worked with the deceased honored their responsibilities rather than exploited opportunities for profit. The story of Riverside Memorial Home served as a warning about what could happen when profit motives overwhelmed ethical obligations in the death care industry, but it also demonstrated that exposure and accountability were possible, that whistleblowers and advocates could challenge exploitative practices and create changes that protected vulnerable families. The deceased deserved dignity in death, and ensuring they received that dignity required vigilance, strong regulations, and a willingness to question even the most trusted institutions when their actions suggested that trust might be misplaced. If this disturbing revelation about what might be happening to your loved ones after you entrust them to funeral home care has made you question everything you thought you knew about the death care industry, you're beginning to understand why advocates like Thomas fight for transparency and accountability. Have you ever felt uneasy about a funeral home's practices, but dismissed your concerns as paranoia or grief-induced suspicion? Did you sign contracts for funeral services without fully reading or understanding every clause? Do you wonder now whether your loved ones received the dignified care you paid for, or whether they were treated as sources of biological materials without your knowledge or consent? Share your own experiences with funeral homes that didn't feel quite right, or questions you wish you had asked during arrangements in the comments below. Your story might help others trust their instincts and demand the transparency that protects the deceased from exploitation. And if this account has revealed that even our most trusted death care institutions can harbor practices that violate everything we believe about honoring the dead, hit that subscribe button for more investigations into industries that profit from our vulnerability and trust. Because sometimes the real horror isn't what we see in funeral homes. It's what happens behind locked doors in the preparation rooms, where families are never allowed, and what's taken from the deceased who can no longer speak for themselves.